They lied to you in crayon and called it history. They took a thief, dressed him in a cape, and sold him to you as a hero. Columbus didn't discover a damn thing. He showed up late to a land that was already singing, already farming, already building cities and calendars and civilizations. Imagine walking into someone else's fully furnished house, feet on their table, food in your mouth, and then claiming, "Look what I found." That's not discovery. That's trespassing with a flag. They erased whole nations with ink and called it a textbook. They buried millions of stories under one pale, shaky name, Columbus. But the land remembers, the rivers remember. The bones beneath the soil remember. This is not a history lesson. This is a correction. And if you stay with me, we're about to drag the myth out into the sunlight and watch it crumble. Columbus didn't discover America. America discovered Columbus. Found him lost in the ocean, chasing spices with stolen maps, sailing on stolen money under a stolen flag. But let's rewind the tape, because before Europe even figured out how to bathe regularly, Africa was out here doing advanced mathematics, charting the stars, building cities that glowed at night. While Europe was arguing about whether the earth was flat, Mali was running universities in Timbuktu, with libraries so thick they made cathedrals look like storage rooms. Scholars, astronomers, doctors, poets, black minds, heavy with brilliance, walking through sunlit courtyards, debating science and spirit like it was sport. While Europe was swinging swords over land and religion, Africa was trading gold, salt, ivory, ideas, caravans moving across the Sahara like mobile kingdoms, maps in their heads, stars as their GPS, navigating deserts that would have swallowed Columbus whole. Let's talk navigation. They say Europeans mastered the seas. Fam, please. Long before Columbus got lost and bumped into the Caribbean, African sailors were hugging coastlines and crossing currents, reading winds like scripture, following tides like drum patterns. There are maps, carvings, oral histories that whisper about black hands touching these shores before Columbus ever mispronounced the word India. But Europe has a talent, not for discovery, for marketing, for remixing theft into exploration, turning invasion into civilization, and stamping discovered on places where people were already living, loving, and building. How do you discover a land where nations already had names, languages already had poetry, roads already had footprints, fires already had stories, dancing in the smoke? You don't discover that. You interrupt it, you invade it, you rename it, you bury the truth and call the lie a holiday. Europe showed up late to the party and then wrote itself in as the host. Meanwhile, Africa was the original blueprint. Europe was the remix. They won't tell you this in school because school was designed to keep your mind politely chained. They'll show you Columbus with his hand on a flag, but they won't show you the bodies, the burning, the erasing, the stolen children, the stolen land, the stolen names. They'll say he discovered a new world. New to who? The people already here, the civilizations already stacked on top of centuries, the ones with agriculture, astronomy, architecture dialed in. No, it was only new to Europe. The same way a thief breaks into your house and swears he found your TV. So understand this, Columbus didn't arrive with enlightenment. He arrived with greed, guns, and God on a business card. He was not a hero, he was an employee, working for crowns that wanted gold, land, and power, and didn't care how many lives got erased along the way. Europe wrote him in as a legend, but legends built on lies don't age well. And now, here we are, peeling back the wallpaper, finding bloodstains underneath the paint. This is not about hating Europe. This is about loving truth. Because when you know what really happened, you stop walking through history like a guest and start standing in it like an heir. Columbus didn't discover America, he trespassed on it. He stumbled onto it, he crashed into a story already in progress and tried to grab the pen. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. It waits. It watches. And then one day, it walks back on stage and says, "Move. I got this." See? While Europe was still arguing about which fork to use at dinner, Africa was out here building calendars that lined up with the stars, while they were drawing dragons at the edge of their maps like, "Here be monsters." Our people were already sailing currents like highways, reading the ocean's breath, treating the wind like an old friend with stories. Columbus didn't discover anything. He just got lost and bumped into a place where people were already raising children, planting corn, praying to the sunrise, counting seasons by the moon's mood. He stepped off that boat confused, half-starved, smelling like 3 wars and no bath, looked around at civilizations older than his language and said, "I found it." That's like breaking into somebody's house and shouting, "I discovered this couch." Nah, you didn't discover it. You just arrived late and loud. Europe writes history like a thief writing the police report. Item was just lying there, owner unknown, so I took it. But Africa remembers. Africa remembers when its children sailed west and south and north, left footprints in places they now call new. Nothing new about it, just old truths with their names scratched off. They trained us to say, "Columbus discovered America," like a spell, like a password to pass their exams. But every time we repeat it, we bury another ancestor. We dim another star in our own sky. Understand this. Europe survives off erasing. Erase the people, erase the story, erase the credit, then sell the lie back to you in a textbook with a gold seal on the cover. Africa survives off memory, off rhythm, off names carried in the mouth like a drum beat, off stories whispered at midnight when the power's out and the only light is truth. They had castles built on greed. We had kingdoms built on balance. They chased gold. We honored land. They cut maps into pieces. We walked the earth like it was one body with different organs. So when they say, "Columbus discovered America," hear what they're really saying. We needed a hero, so we invented one. We needed an entrance, so we erased the ones already in the room. But history is stubborn. Truth is petty. It don't like being lied on. So now, the same ocean that carried his ships is coughing up receipts. Bones, artifacts, stories, DNA waking up like, "Surprise, we were here before your fairy tale." And that African presence, the one they tried to drown, burn, bury under flags and holidays, it just steps forward, brushes off the dust, looks the world in the eye and says, "I was crossing oceans while you were still arguing if the earth was flat. I was mapping stars while you were arguing who owned the moon. I was building cities while you were still building excuses." So no, Columbus didn't discover America. America discovered Columbus. Shivering, lost, clutching a cross and a compass, standing on a shore that looked back at him and thought, "This, the one they sent?" And somewhere deep in the marrow of this planet, Africa, laughed, not a cruel laugh, a knowing one. The kind of laugh an elder gives when the lie finally runs out of breath and the truth steps up to the mic, cracks its knuckles, leans in and says, "Let me talk now." See? When truth finally grabs that mic, first thing it does is snatch that Columbus poster off the wall and tear it right down the middle. Because let's be clear, you can't discover a place where people already got house keys, grandmothers, burial grounds, and recipes older than your religion. That's not discovery. That's trespassing with PR. Columbus didn't discover America. He just got lost, bumped into somebody else's front yard. Then Europe pulled up like, "Nice land you got here. Be a shame if a flag just fell on it." They teach you this fairy tale like he was some brave explorer slicing through the unknown. But the only thing he really discovered was how far Europe was willing to go to pretend nobody existed before they showed up. Now let's talk contrast. Europe back then, dirty cities, crowded streets, plagues, doing victory laps, kings arguing with popes about who got the bigger ego. Meanwhile, in Africa, libraries in Timbuktu where books were worth more than gold, universities before Europe could even spell it right, mathematicians in Mali, astronomers in the Nile Valley, architects stacking stone into sky while Europe was still arguing about whether bathing was witchcraft. They call Europe the old world, but Africa is the ancient one, the original, the blueprint. When Europe was still trying to wash the mud off its boots, Africa was mapping the stars, charting the seasons, carving wisdom into walls that still stand, while empires that mocked them are dust in forgotten tongues. So Columbus leaves a Europe that was hungry, greedy, itching for land like a rash, and crashes into a world already full of nations, trade routes, engineers, farmers, philosophers, healers. But in Europe's version of the story, the people here were savages, the Africans were cargo, and Columbus was a hero because the lie needed a face and they picked his. They didn't discover America, they rebranded it. They didn't meet the people, they renamed them. They didn't bring civilization, they brought erasers, big ones with ships. And while Columbus was stumbling around, writing in his diary about gold and God, Africa was already in the mix. Black hands on the oars, black bodies in the hull, black names erased from the logbooks and replaced with numbers and chains. Europe wrote the script like it was the main character, but the truth? Europe was the loud cousin who shows up late to the party, knocks over the food, steals the stereo, then tells everybody the party never started until they walked in. Meanwhile, Africa was the DJ, the architect, the cook, the electrician, the drummer, the heartbeat under the floorboards of this whole so-called new world. So when they say Columbus discovered America, hear it for what it is, a spell, a chant, a classroom incantation to make you forget that the people he found already had passports to their own land, and your ancestors were dragged into that same story as shadows, not authors. But the spell is breaking now. The elder is laughing. The mic is hot. And the truth is just getting warmed up. Columbus didn't discover America. America discovered Columbus, found him lost, confused, following bad directions from a broken compass and a greedy crown. They told you he was a hero. Nah, he was a glitch in the story, given a statue, a holiday, and halo by people who write history in pencil and erase in blood. Listen close. When Columbus got here, there were cities already breathing, roads already woven, trade routes older than his language, maps written in memory, in stars and rivers, in the way the wind curved through the trees. He didn't discover a thing. He just showed up uninvited, like that cousin who brings drama and then swears he built the vibe. You know what discovery means in their dictionary? It means, I see it now, so it matters. I touched it, so it's mine. I planted a flag, so your whole existence is now a footnote. That's not discovery. That's trespassing with paperwork. Europe loves to start the movie when they walk on set. Fade in, white sails, crosses on flags, hungry eyes scanning the shoreline like a menu. But rewind that tape. Before Europe even knew how to bathe regularly, Africa was glowing. While they were arguing about who was human, Africa was carving knowledge into stone, measuring the stars with naked eyes, counting time with shadows and pyramids. Before they had the Renaissance, we had libraries in Timbuktu stacked with books so heavy the floorboards of history still bend under their weight. Before they learned to navigate the coast, our people rode the Sahara like a highway, sailed the Nile like a main street, moved gold, salt, ideas from kingdom to kingdom, like passing a drumbeat down a line. Europe crawled out of the dark ages, squinting at the sun, and Africa was already wearing it like jewelry. But they won't tell you that. They'll tell you Columbus brought civilization. To who? To people with calendars, medicine, architecture, and order. That's like a man with a flip phone telling you he invented the internet. See the game yet? They frame Europe as the light, Africa as the shadow, Europe as the teacher, Africa as the student, Europe as the explorer, Africa as the discovered. But look closer. Europe was running from famine, from plague, from debt, from kings who taxed them down to the bone. They weren't exploring, they were escaping. Africa was the plug, the gold in their crowns, ours, the sugar in their tea, ours, the cotton in their wealth, ours, the bodies that built their empires, ours, stolen, chained, shipped, names stripped, languages broken, memories buried under new flags. Columbus was just an early delivery man for a system that turned human beings into cargo. He gets the credit, but the real story is the machine behind him. The crowns, the churches, the merchants, all hungry, all reaching, all calling theft, trade, and invasion, discovery. Understand this. You can't discover people who already had names for the land, names for the mountains, names for the seasons, names for the Creator. You can't discover a place where children are laughing, fires are burning, elders are teaching, markets are buzzing, and the soil already remembers footsteps. That's not discovery. That's arrival. That's intrusion. That's the first knock on the door before centuries of storm. And while Europe was busy planting flags in stolen soil, Africa was being carved up like a feast they were never invited to. Lines on maps drawn in offices, ink tracing rivers they'd never seen, slicing through villages, families, languages like they were cutting cake. But here's the twist. For all their maps, they still lost the plot, because you can redraw borders, rename continents, rewrite textbooks, but you can't delete memory from the blood. We remember that before Columbus ever got lost at sea, Africans had already touched these shores. Currents don't lie, winds don't lie, stone heads in the Americas with African features don't lie. But they'll call that controversial while teaching you fairy tales as fact. This is the contrast. Europe arrived late and wrote themselves as the opening act. Africa was the original signal, broadcasting wisdom across oceans while Europe was still buffering. Europe came with crosses and cannons, contracts and chains. Africa came with drums and science, spirit and trade. Europe said, "We discovered you." Africa said, "We've been here." Europe said, "We brought you God." Africa said, "Wait, we were talking to God before you could read." So when they tell you it's Columbus discovered America, hear what they're really saying. Our story starts when we show up. Our truth is the only truth that counts. Your history is a rumor until we stamp it with our approval. Nah, not anymore. The mic is hot. The lies are sweating. And the next part of the story, it's not about Columbus at all. It's about us, about memory waking up, about Africa standing back up in the mirror, looking history in the eye and saying, "I am not your side note. I am the source." Columbus didn't discover America. He just got lost and landed on somebody else's front porch with a flag in his hand and a story in his mouth. They told you he found it, like the land was hiding, like the people were invisible, like millions of souls were just background noise to a European compass. Let's be clear. You don't discover a house when a whole family's been living in it for thousands of years. You just show up uninvited and start acting like the landlord. They call it discovery. We call it what it was: arrival, invasion, occupation, followed by centuries of erasure, papered over with pretty words and schoolbook lies. See, Europe's greatest magic trick was not the ship, not the gun, not the map. Europe's greatest magic trick was the story that said, "We arrived, therefore it began. We named it, therefore it is. We wrote it down, therefore it's true." But here's the part they never wanted whispered. Before Columbus ever lost his way, Africa had already found hers. Before his ships scraped the edges of the Atlantic, African sails had kissed those waters. African minds had mapped those stars. African hands had built cities that made Europe look like it was still learning to stand upright. They gave you Europe as the starting line, like history clocked in at 1492, like the world woke up when Europe opened its eyes. No, history did not begin when Europe finally looked up from its dark ages and saw sunlight on somebody else's land, while Europe was still arguing with the plague. Timbuktu was running universities. While European kings were eating with dirty hands, African empires were bathing daily, trading gold, charting constellations, writing books that still sit in dusty libraries they don't want you to read. They told you Columbus braved the unknown. Unknown to who? The Atlantic wasn't some empty void. It was a road. And roads remember footsteps. But when Europe writes the script, everybody else becomes tribe, while they become nation. Your genius becomes myth. Their violence becomes civilization. They call their invasion contact. They call your resistance savage. They call your memory folklore. They call their lies curriculum. And in that curriculum, Africa is a side character, entering stage left in chains, no backstory, no brilliance, just a nameless body on an auction block. But truth don't stay buried forever. Bones rise. Memories push through concrete. And Africa is standing back up in the mirror, dusting off the centuries and saying, Columbus didn't discover anything. He arrived late to a world already in motion. America was not a blank page. It was a full library they tried to burn and rewrite. Europe came with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, preaching heaven, delivering hell, stamping flags over graves, renaming rivers like God took a day off and asked them to finish creation. But listen, when you know who you are, their stories stop fitting. Africa is not a guest in a world history. Africa is the drumbeat the timeline's been marching to from the beginning. So when they say Columbus discovered America, hear it for what it is, a confession of arrogance, not a statement of fact. Because the earth was already spinning, the people were already living. The knowledge was already flowing from Nile to Niger, from Mali to Mexico, from Kush to the Caribbean currents. The only thing Columbus discovered was how far Europe was willing to go to steal a future and erase a past. And now, that memory is waking up now that Africa is looking history in the eye. The script is shaking, the lie is trembling, the story is changing. Columbus didn't discover America. He just got lost and landed on somebody else's front porch. But Europe called it a discovery, stamped it in textbooks, filmed it in movies, celebrated it with parades and fireworks, like a thief bragging about how hard he worked to break into your house. Let's be clear, you don't discover a place where people been cooking, praying, birthing, loving, building cities, mapping stars, long before your boat even touched the water. That's not discovery, that's trespassing, that's invasion, that's walking into a full house and acting like the landlord. But that's Europe's talent, isn't it? Rename what it can't create, rewrite what it can't control, rebrand what it doesn't understand. Europe steps in late to the party and acts like the party started when it walked in. Meanwhile, Africa was the DJ, the architect, the electrician, the one who built the house, wired the sound, and still got left off the guest list of its own creation. They say Columbus found America in 1492. By then, Africa had already raised pyramids that touched the sky, calculated the length of the year, studied the heavens with naked eyes and genius minds, sent knowledge across deserts and rivers like letters from God. But Europe turned up late, dirty boots on holy ground, and the world started calling them explorers. Explorer? Nah. That's a cute word for someone who shows up with a flag in one hand and chains in the other. They didn't discover America. They discovered an opportunity to erase, to bury, to rename, to rearrange. They stepped onto land with nations already living, languages already singing, philosophies already breathing, and said, "This is new." New to who? Not to the children of the sun who crossed oceans on currents and stars, who left footprints in stone and memory, who carved faces into mountains and myths, not to the people whose stories got burned, banned, and buried so Europe could stand on a stolen stage and call itself the beginning. See the contrast. Europe writes history like a crime scene report with the criminal holding the pen. Africa holds history like an heirloom passed palm to palm, word to word, drum to drum. Europe says we discovered. Africa says we remembered. Europe plants a flag. Africa plants a seed. Europe crosses the sea for gold. Africa crosses the sea for God, for trade, for kin, for curiosity, not conquest. They turned Columbus into a hero, a saint in a sailor's hat, while the ground beneath his boots was soaked in someone else's tears. But now the spell is cracking. The children of Africa are reading between the lines, seeing the red ink in the margins of history, hearing the screams behind the silence of the page. Columbus didn't discover America. He just walked into a story already in motion, pressed pause on everyone else, pressed record on himself, and Europe called it the beginning. But beginnings don't start with boats. They start with roots. And our roots, they stretch from the Nile to the Niger, from the Congo to the Caribbean, from the Cape to the Carolinas. We were here in the wind, in the rhythm, in the science, in the names they tried to erase. So now when they say, in 1492, Columbus discovered, we answer, no. In 1492, Europe arrived late, lied loud, and the world believed it. Until now, because Africa is awake, and when Africa speaks, even the lies start sweating. The map is changing, the credits are rolling again, and this time our names are on the screen. They told you Columbus discovered America like this land was a lost sock under Europe's bed. Like millions of people hadn't been breathing here, loving here, building here long before his ship scraped the shore. That's not discovery. That's trespassing with good PR. They teach you the story like a fairy tale with a flag. Columbus the brave, Columbus the bold, Columbus the visionary. But they skip the chapters where people got erased, cultures got buried, and whole nations were renamed like stray dogs picked up off the street. Europe moves like this. Show up late, break the door, change the locks, then act like the house was empty. Africa moves different. We knew land was sacred, not a trophy. We knew people were nations, not numbers. We knew a journey wasn't conquest, it was connection. Long before Europe drew crooked lines on clean maps, Africans were sailing the seas, reading stars like scripture, trading gold, salt, ideas. No age of discovery banner needed. Europe calls it discovery when they finally show up. Africa calls it Tuesday because we've been here, been moving, been building, no drum roll required. Columbus didn't discover America, he just crashed into it. Then Europe wrote a poem where he was the hero and everybody else was background noise. But the volume is changing, the silence is cracking. The credits you grew up watching were a bootleg version of history. Now the real reel is playing. The camera zooms out. You see empires in Mali glowing like constellations, libraries in Timbuktu humming with ink and wisdom, caravans stretching across the Sahara like veins carrying the lifeblood of trade. While Europe was still arguing about who owned which muddy field, Africa was counting galaxies in the desert night, stacking cities by the river, speaking in tongues older than their calendars. But they told you we were primitive. They told you we were late. Funny how the thief always swears the homeowner doesn't deserve the house. Columbus didn't discover America. Europe discovered a new place to be greedy, a new place to plant flags and bury bodies under monuments. They called it New World. New to who? Not to the ones who named every river, buried their elders in that soil, sang stories into the mountains. And while Europe was busy writing themselves into every first page, Africa's name was getting edited out like we were a typo in our own story. But that era is ending. The lie is tired. The mask is slipping. The map is changing. The credits are rolling again. And this time, our names are on the screen. Not as extras, not as tribesmen number 3 in somebody else's saga, but as architects of eras, owners of oceans, time travelers with memory in our bones. Columbus didn't open the world. He walked into a room our ancestors helped build and acted like he invented doors. Now we're here to repossess the narrative. To say it plain, you cannot discover people. You cannot discover a place that's already loving, living, and calling itself by name. Europe had cannons. Africa had civilizations. Europe had guns. Africa had wisdom. They wrote the story with smoke. We kept the truth in our spirit, waiting for a generation bold enough to speak it. That generation is you. So when they say, Columbus discovered America, you look them in the eye and answer, no, he just arrived. And the bill for that arrival is still being paid. Now sit with that, because once you see the lie in that one line, you start seeing the edits everywhere. And once you see the edits, you stop reading their script and start writing your own. They told you Columbus discovered America like a thief breaking into your house, then acting like he built it. How you discover a place where whole nations already cooking, drumming, loving, raising children under ancient stars. That ain't discovery. That's invasion with good PR. But peep the pattern. In their story, Europe is the brain, the hero, the light switch that turned the world on. Everything before them. Dark, primitive, lost. Meanwhile, Africa, the same Africa that mapped the stars, measured the Nile's moods, built kingdoms so fly they still can't explain the math, gets written in as the background noise, a footnote, a jungle, a wound. Europe discovers. Africa gets discovered. Europe explores. Africa is explored. Europe civilizes. Africa is civilized. See the trick? They keep Europe doing the verbs and Africa catching the verbs. One is the hand, the other is the object. They say Europe sailed out bravely into the unknown. But unknown to who? Unknown to men who thought the world began at the edge of their own shoreline. Africans had been moving, trading, learning, long before some nervous sailor started hugging the coast like a scared child holding onto the wall in a dark hallway. They won't tell you about African sailors who rode currents like highways, about maps that existed before their age of discovery, about cities like Timbuktu where books were stacked higher than their church ceilings, where knowledge moved like currency and scholars walked like royalty. No, they give you a Europe that woke the world up and an Africa that was asleep. But ask yourself, if Africa was sleeping, why did they cross oceans to chain its people, rob its soil, and bottle its genius? Nobody raids a place with nothing in it. They erased whole civilizations with one word, savage. They buried whole lineages with one phrase, no history. They turned living cultures into blank spaces, then wrote their own names across the page. Columbus didn't discover America. Europe didn't discover the world. They discovered how easy it was to rename what they wanted, to redraw what they wanted, to rewrite who we were while we were still standing there breathing. That's the real new world they built. A world where lies wear suits and truth gets dressed up as myth. But once you see that, once you see how they crown themselves the main character of every story, you start asking dangerous questions. If Columbus was a lie, what did they hide about the Moors in Europe? What did they hide about Kemet in the Nile? What did they hide about the kingdoms that made gold look like dust and wisdom look like water? Because trust, when they say Europe rose, they forget to mention what it had to stand on. And a whole lot of that foundation was African. Now the page is in your hands. Their version says you came from nothing and should be grateful for crumbs. But you come from builders, navigators, healers, from people who read the sky like scripture and the soil like a diary. So when they say Columbus discovered America, you don't just correct the sentence, You question the whole book. You stop letting Europe be the sun and Africa the shadow. Because the truth, Africa wasn't in the dark. Africa was the light they didn't want the world to see. Columbus didn't discover America. He just got lost and bumped into a place where people were already cooking dinner. But Europe loves a good magic trick. They show up late to the party, then rewrite the story like the music didn't start till they walked in. They call it discovery when they arrive, invasion when we survive, civilizing when we refuse to die. Understand this. Before Columbus ever touched a wave, Europe was coughing in the dark. Plagues, filth in the streets, kings bathing twice a year and calling it luxury. Church bells ringing over empty stomachs, witches burned for knowing herbs, scientists jailed for asking questions. Meanwhile, in Africa, we were charting the stars while they were still arguing about whether the earth was flat. We were building cities with streetlights in Timbuktu, libraries so thick with knowledge that pages breathed like lungs. We were mapping coastlines, sailing oceans, trading gold for salt, ideas for ideas long before a European compass ever pointed west with confidence. Europe had castles, Africa had kingdoms, Europe had crusades, Africa had universities, Europe had knights in rusty armor, swinging swords for land. Africa had scholars in flowing robes, wielding words sharper than steel. And when Columbus sailed, he didn't carry civilization on his ships. He carried contracts, crosses, chains, and a hunger to own what was never his. They tell you he found America like it was some lost sock behind Europe's couch. But millions of people were already here, with languages, laws, cornfields, and calendars, stories older than his hometown. You can't discover a land that's feeding nations. You can only arrive, announce yourself, and start lying. So what did Europe really discover? They discovered new lands to carve up, new backs to break, new names to erase, new gods to enforce. They discovered a new stage to perform that same old play. We are the center, you are the shadow. But remember, shadows don't exist without light. And that light so often was Africa. While Europe was stumbling out of the Dark Ages, Africa was the lighthouse on the hill. Gold glowing in the Mali sun. Knowledge shining in Songhai courts, mathematics, medicine, astronomy flowing through black hands that history tried to hide. They taught you Columbus like a bedtime story, so you'd sleep through the robbery. But this is the wake-up call, the alarm clock with no snooze button. Columbus didn't discover America. Europe discovered a new lie to tell, and they told it so loud, so long, that even we started whispering it to our own children. That ends now, because once you see the trick, the magician loses power. Once you know the map was rigged, you stop begging for directions. Africa was not waiting in the dark for Europe to bring the light. Africa was the light, and that light is still burning in you. Columbus didn't discover America. He just bumped into a place where people were already cooking dinner. But that's how the story goes when the pen is in the hands of the one who arrived late and still wants to sit at the head of the table. Europe called it discovery. We call it what it was, a flag and stolen soil, a map drawn over somebody else's heartbeat. They stepped off the boat looking lost, and somehow the world decided they were the guides. Understand this. You can't discover a land where children are already playing, where grandmothers are already praying, where languages are already dancing in the air. That's not discovery. That's intrusion dressed up in a fancy costume. Europe writes, "In the beginning there was nothing, then we arrived." Africa replies, "We were building cities while you were still arguing about baths." While castles in Europe were damp, dark, and diseased, Timbuktu was glowing with libraries, scholars bending over books like they were sacred fire. While Europe was screaming witch at women who knew herbs, Africa was performing surgery, setting bones, writing medical texts in ink that still hasn't faded. While Europe was carving borders with blood and steel, Africa was carving stories into wood, into stone, into memory. passing wisdom down, not just through books, but through rhythm, through drum, through proverb, through name. But when they arrived, they flipped the script. Europe, Euro teacher. Africa, Euro student. Europe, Euro civilized. Africa, Euro wild. Europe, Euro the future. Africa, Euro the past. That's not history. That's marketing. They buried our brilliance under their headlines. They erased our footprints and then called us lost. Yet here's the twist. Even their lies couldn't dim our truth. Because while they were busy drawing crooked maps, Africa was mapping something else. The stars, the seasons, the soul. Europe chased gold in the ground. Africa shaped gold into crowns, into bracelets, into art so detailed it made metal look like it could breathe. Europe came for resources. Africa was the resource. Mind, body, spirit, soil. They sailed west and said, "We discovered a new world." No, they invaded an old one and slapped a new name on it. Just like they tried to rename you. But listen, once you understand Columbus didn't discover anything, you start to see the pattern. They don't discover, they rename. They don't enlighten, they rebrand. They don't create, they claim. They claimed America. They claimed science. They claimed philosophy. They even tried to claim God like he was some patent. Meanwhile, Africa was over here, whispering to the rivers, talking to the trees, building worlds inside the drumbeat, walking with God before anybody translated his name. Europe points at Africa and says, "Be grateful we found you." Africa laughs and answers, "You found us. We were the ones holding the compass to your humanity." So remember this, if Columbus can discover a land already full of nations, then you can rediscover the greatness they tried to bury in you. Because the biggest lie they ever sold was not that he found America, it's that they are the measure of what is real, what is smart, what is beautiful, what is possible. Nah, the measure was never theirs. The measure was ours, from the first drum to the last heartbeat. And that's where we go next. Back to the source, back to the root, back to the truth they couldn't erase no matter how many flags they planted. They told you history began when a lost sailor bumped into a coastline he couldn't spell right. Discovery, they called it. Like the land was hiding, like the rivers were shy, like the people were ghosts waiting on a flag to feel real. Nah, let's clear the smoke. Before Columbus got seasick on the Atlantic, Africa was already running civilizations like clockwork. Europe was still trying to wash once a week, fighting rats, arguing with plagues, calling sickness the will of God, because they didn't know what a germ was. Meanwhile, in Africa, we had cities that glowed at night, libraries that kissed the sky, mathematics dancing in the dust under children's feet, gold so normal it was just another Tuesday. Timbuktu wasn't a rumor, it was a university. Scholars, astronomers, philosophers, scribes, stacked in the Sahel like stars in the sky. Mansa Musa walked the earth, and economies shook. He took one trip, and the price of gold caught a fever. But they don't put that in your textbooks. They'll tell you Columbus discovered America, but won't tell you African sailors rode those same waves with the sun as their compass and the stars as their map long before a Spanish crown signed a permission slip. They'll tell you Europe brought civilization like Africa was a blank page waiting on their ink. But let's compare. Europe was building castles to hide from the cold. Africa was building kingdoms to dance with the sun. Europe was carving borders with blood and steel. Africa was carving stories into stone and memory. Europe was praying to survive the winter. Africa was planting 3 harvests a year, feeding empires, trading across deserts, sailing along coasts they pretend we never knew. They brag about age of discovery, like the world was asleep until they woke it up. But the Nile had already learned to write its own name. The Congo was already humming with iron and fire. Great Zimbabwe was already stacking stone like poetry in granite. So when Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean, he didn't discover anything. He arrived at a party that started thousands of years before his ship ever touched water. The land was known. The roots were mapped in memory and song. The people had names, gods, science, systems, seasons, stories, older than his language. He didn't discover. He interrupted, he invaded, he renamed, he buried. And then they had the nerve to turn that interruption into a holiday, into a children's story, into a lie so big they printed it on calendars and called it history. But we remember. We remember that Africa was not some side character waiting for Europe's spotlight. Africa was the stage, the drum, the script, the opening act, and the main event. Europe arrived late, loud and underdressed, then tried to rewrite the whole play. Columbus didn't discover America. He just walked in on a world that was already spinning, already shining, already singing its own name. And now, piece by piece, truth by truth, we're snatching the pen back, because the story doesn't start with his arrival. It starts with our presence, our movement, our memory. And that's the part they could never erase. Columbus didn't discover America. He just got lost and bumped into a place where people were already living, already building, already praying, already loving, already dying, already naming the stars in their own language. And they call it discovery when a European shows up. But when the people are brown or copper or black like midnight with no moon, they call it primitive, tribe, savage, untouched land. Untouched. By who? By Europe? That's the only map they care about. See, Europe wrote the script, then handed us the movie with half the cast erased. They zoomed in on one pale sailor and blurred out millions of faces that were already there. They teach you Columbus like he was the first man to ever look at a wave and feel curious, as if Africans weren't already sailing the world, trading gold, mapping currents, reading the ocean like a holy book. Europe was busy arguing about whose god was real, burning women as witches, drawing crooked borders around kingdoms that would crumble. Africa was humming with cities, Timbuktu shining with libraries, scrolls stacked higher than their cathedrals, scholars debating under desert stars, mathematicians counting what Europe didn't even know existed. They'll show you a painting of Columbus in some stiff collar, pointing at a horizon like he invented direction. But they won't show you the Malian fleets that rode the Atlantic before his grandparents even learned to bathe regular. They won't mention Abalakari II sailing west with ships and courage, because if Africa was crossing oceans before Europe learned to spell ocean, then their whole fairy tale starts to crack. They tell you Europe discovered America. Nah, Europe discovered new ways to lie, new ways to rename theft as mission, new ways to bury people under flags and call it civilization. America wasn't an empty stage waiting for a European actor. It was already a full production. Nations, roads, farms, medicine, stories, ceremonies, calendars carved into stone, corn pulled from the earth like gold from the soil. But the script said, if Europe didn't see you, you weren't there. If Europe didn't write you, you had no history. If Europe didn't crown you, you had no kings. Meanwhile, in Africa, gold was flowing, drums were speaking, queens were ruling, iron was bending, art was breathing in bronze and wood. Europe was cold, hungry, and curious. Africa was warm, fed, and ancient. So when those ships left Europe, they weren't bringing light to darkness. They were bringing greed to abundance. They were bringing plague to people. They were bringing chains to free soil. Columbus didn't discover America. Europe just arrived late to a party they were never invited to, flipped the table, stole the house, renamed the street, and wrote themselves in as the founders. But here's the twist. You can't discover people who already discovered themselves. You can't erase what the land remembers. You can't bury what the blood still sings. So when they say, In 1492, Columbus discovered America. You say, no. In 1492, Europe crashed into a world it didn't understand and started lying about it. Africa knew the ocean. America knew the soil. Europe knew the pen and used it like a weapon. And that's why we write now, to flip the script back, to put the stolen pages in their rightful order, to say the quiet parts out loud, because our story didn't start with Columbus or chains or ships. Our story started long before their maps, long before their flags, long before their language learned how to twist our names. And this time, we're the ones holding the pen. They teach you that history is a hallway that starts in Europe, like the world only woke up when their bells rang. But let's talk plain. Before Europe knew the taste of soap, we were washing gold dust off our fingers. Before they drew crooked lines on stolen maps, we were sailing rivers that knew our names. They had castles made of cold stone, damp, dark, smelling like fear and old bread. We had kingdoms made of sunlight and rhythm, Timbuktu libraries, scrolls stacked higher than their church steeples, ink running thick with equations and empires. They brag about Renaissance, like the world was reborn when they finally opened their curtains. Meanwhile, Africa was already in full bloom, rocking astronomy, medicine, architecture, so advanced their great-great-grandkids still can't explain it. They were praying in Latin to stained glass windows they couldn't even read, while our griots were spitting history over drums, word for word, name by name, 1,000 years deep. No textbook, no printing press, just memory sharper than any sword. They sent Columbus chasing spices and shortcuts, a lost man with a compass and a sponsor, crashing into a land where people were already breathing, already building, already loving, already fighting, already praying. But they called it discovery. That's the trick right there. When Europe arrives, your existence becomes a rumor, your land becomes new, your people become resources, your gods become myths, your history becomes mythology, their lies become curriculum. Understand this, Columbus didn't discover anything. He interrupted, he trespassed, he stumbled in, looked around, and his people wrote the script like they were the main characters. But ask yourself, how you discover a place where the soil already knows the footsteps of generations, how you find a land where the children already know which stars mean rain, which roots heal pain, which songs wake the ancestors. Europe came with crosses and contracts, ink and iron, smiles up front, chains in the back. Africa had cities where the streets were cleaner than their royal halls. We had trade routes stretching like braided hair from the Sahara to the seas. We had art carved so smooth stone started to look like it was breathing. They were arguing if witches float, we were charting the movement of planets. They were burning women at the stake. We were crowning queens who ruled armies and economies. So when they say Columbus discovered America, hear what they're really saying. Your story doesn't count until we walk in. But that spell is broken now. We remember. We remember that our timeline doesn't start with their arrival or their flags or their fragile little titles. Our story runs older than their calendars, wider than their borders, deeper than their oceans. Next time they bring up Columbus, don't argue. Just smile and say, "Brother, you can't discover a house when you the one standing on the porch." Discovery? Europe been throwing that word around like confetti at a parade they didn't even pay for. They call it the age of discovery. Cute. You mean the age of getting lost and writing books about it? Let's talk contrast. While Europe was choking on plague, arguing over which king had the fanciest hat, Africa was out here doing math in the dark and counting stars by their government names. They had castles with rats. We had cities with libraries. They had knights in rusty armor. We had scholars in clean white robes copying texts by lamplight in Timbuktu, while the Niger flowed like a golden vein through the body of the continent. They had kings fighting cousins over muddy fields. We had Mansa Musa walking into Mecca so heavy with gold he bent the price of metal for a decade. They had villages praying for sun. We had engineers bending rivers, farmers reading the soil like scripture, architects laying stone so precise those walls still standing after their empires turned to dust. They had "Here be monsters" scribbled on the edge of their maps. We had sailors who knew the moods of the ocean by the taste of the wind. Currents, stars, seasons, all memorized like grandma's recipes. So when they say, "Columbus discovered America," understand the joke. A man leaves a continent of debt, disease, and dirty water, gets lost on the way to Asia, crashes into a world that's been spinning without him for thousands of years, and they throw him a parade for tripping over somebody else's front yard. Meanwhile, on our side of the story, we had caravans crossing Sahara like moving cities of cloth and dust, trading salt, gold, ideas long before Europe could even spell global. We had kingdoms with tax codes, trade routes, universities, legal systems that didn't need wig-wearing judges to pretend at wisdom. They were drawing dragons on the edges of maps. We were drawing blueprints for mosques and palaces. They were whispering fears about falling off the edge of the world. We were tracking the sky's rhythm, naming constellations, charting seasons, moving with the universe like a drumline on time. So no, Columbus didn't discover America. He arrived late to a land already humming. He stepped into a song already on the second verse. He walked into a theater where the play was 3 acts deep, then tried to rename the show after himself. Europe wrote the script where they, the hero, the explorer, the brave adventurer. But when you zoom out, when you pull the camera back over deserts, rivers, and black skin shining in the sun, you see the real picture. They weren't discovering, they were catching up. And even then, only because Africa had already taught the world how to move. Europe was late to the party, but loud at the door. Showed up drunk on hunger, shaky with greed, boots muddy, maps empty, eyes wide like, "Look what we found." Found? Boy, you walked into a house that was already built, already painted, already lit, with the food still warm and the music still playing. You didn't discover the party. You interrupted it. Before Columbus ever got lost and bumped his head on the wrong shore, Africa was out here doing the world tours with no applause. We were carving stories into stone while Europe was still whispering to the dark. We were counting stars with naked eyes, measuring the earth with ropes and memory, while they were arguing about whether the world would make them fall off the edge. We were sailing the Nile like a highway of time, reading currents, listening to the wind, building ships that kissed the Indian Ocean, trading gold, ivory, incense, ideas, long before Europe even believed there was more to life than its own cold reflection. Contrast this. Africa was a library written in sunlight. Europe was a room fumbling for a candle. Africa was cities aligned to the stars, mathematics in the bricks, geometry in the streets, sacred science in the angles of our temples. Europe was plagues and panic, priests shouting at comets, kings praying for spice while their people rotted in the alleys. Africa was universities in Timbuktu, books stacked like mountains, scholars debating the cosmos under desert moons. Europe was burning women for knowing too much, calling a wisdom witchcraft, calling fear faith. So when they say Columbus discovered America, understand the trick. The same mouths that called Africa the dark continent were squinting in the brightness of what we had already lit. They erased maps that didn't start with them. They buried stories that didn't bow to them. They renamed theft discovery and invasion civilization. But history is not a bedtime story, it's a crime scene. And if you dust it for fingerprints, you see African hands all over the blueprint of motion, trade routes, star roads, river routes, sea routes, while Europe was still arguing over who owned the church. So, no. Columbus didn't discover America. He just walked onto a stage that had already been built by hands they refused to credit, under a sky we had already mapped, in a world we had already connected. They were late. We were first. They wrote the textbook. We wrote the timeline. They said Columbus discovered America like a thief breaking into your house, then claiming he built it. Europe wrote it like a fairy tale. Brave sailor, blue seas, new world. But here's the cut. You can't discover a place where people already got front doors, grandmothers, and graveyards. See, Europe moves like this. Show up late. Act like the host. Rename the house. Then erase the guest list. Africa moves different. We move like roots. We move like rivers. We were sailing when they were still arguing about if the earth was flat. They had caravels. We had kingdoms. They had maps with blank spaces. We had trade routes written in the stars. They prayed for wind. We understood the wind. Europe was busy drawing borders. Africa was building civilizations. Timbuktu had libraries while they were still fumbling in the dark, calling it the Dark Ages because they couldn't see past their own candles. They sent Columbus with crosses and cannons. We sent travelers with knowledge and culture. They came hunting gold. We came carrying science, rhythm, and memory. They planted flags. We planted families. They brought disease. We brought design. They brought chains. We brought charts of the ocean currents, stories of lands beyond the sunset, whispers of journeys they'll never put in a school book. Understand this. Discovery is just a pretty word for we showed up, lied, and rewrote the story. They call it exploration when they cross the water. They call it migration when we cross the water. They call it invasion when we come with strength. But when they came with guns and greed, they called it civilization. Europe sells myths. Africa carries receipts. Their version, a lost Italian with a Spanish flag bumps into an island and suddenly discovers a continent. Our version, we were already moving. Moorish maps, African sailors, quiet footprints in the sand long before Columbus ever begged for ships. Their story starts with a ship. Our story starts with a drum. Their story starts with conquest. Our story starts with connection. They wrote the textbook, we wrote the timeline. And when you read between their lines, you start to see ours. Columbus didn't discover America. He just arrived at the scene of a world already in motion, looked around, and signed his name on somebody else's front porch. Europe crowned him a hero. History crowned him a myth. Truth strips him down to size, a lost man with a good PR team. Meanwhile, Africa, we were never lost, just written out. But ink fades, truth doesn't. And now, the story's shifting back to its original owners. Europe wrote fairy tales. Africa lived receipts. They had maps drawn in wine-stained rooms, guessing at the edges of the world, like kids tracing monsters in the dark. We had coastlines carved into memory, routes braided into language, currents studied like scripture, stars read like family names. Europe sailed on rumors. Africa moved on rhythm. They tell you Columbus found America like the place was a lost sock, like millions of people were ghosts, like pyramids in the sand and stone cities in the Andes just appeared one morning and waited for a European to give them a name. That's not discovery. That's trespassing with good PR. Understand this. While Europe was arguing about whose God was better, Africa was trading gold, salt, ideas, stretching from Timbuktu to the Nile, from the Swahili coast to the Cape, from the Sahara's edge to kingdoms they never taught you about. Europe was busy drawing borders on maps. Africa was busy moving across oceans. Long before Columbus missed his turn and bumped into the Caribbean, African sails had already kissed those winds. Black hands had already gripped those oars. Brown feet had already walked those shores. But when Europe arrived, they didn't come with respect. They came with contracts and crosses, flags and firearms ready to rename, rewrite, and rearrange. They called it New World because they were new to it. like walking into a full house, food on the table, kids playing, elders talking and yelling, "Look what I discovered." Europe planted flags. Africa planted people. Europe came for resources. Africa came as relatives, as craftsmen, navigators, builders, and later dragged in chains to build a land they'd never be allowed to own. They teach you Columbus like a savior, but skip over the bodies, the cultures erased, the languages buried under church bells and gun smoke. They show you Europe as the brain, Africa as the muscle. But here's the twist. Africa was the architect. Europe just stole the blueprints and burned the library. So when they say Columbus discovered America, hear the lie behind the accent. Hear the erasures hidden in that one soft word. Discovery? No. You can't discover people who already had cities, calendars, and ceremonies. You can't discover land that's already named in 1,000 tongues. You can only invade it, rename it, and hope the ink outlives the memory. But ink fades, and we're still here. Europe gave you the myth. Africa gives you the receipt, and this time we're not asking to be believed. We're telling you the compass is turning, the fog is lifting, and the real story is walking back on stage. Columbus didn't discover America. He just showed up late to a party that had been booming for thousands of years. By the time his ship touched shore, there were nations, roads, mathematics, astronomy, languages older than his hometown. But Europe wrote the script like, "First time here must be new." Walked into a full house and called it empty. See, Europe had this habit. If they didn't write it, it didn't happen. If they didn't see it, it wasn't real. If they couldn't control it, they called it savage, then tried to civilize it by erasing it. They say Columbus discovered America the way they say Africa had no history, like we were just waiting backstage for them to hand us a microphone. Meanwhile, Africa been the blueprint. While Europe was arguing over who owned whose soul, Africa was charting stars, mapping currents, reading the sky like scripture, and the ocean like a familiar road. Europe feared the ocean, called it the abyss, the edge of the world where monsters lived. Africa studied it, named its moods, learned its rhythm, rode its back like a trusted beast. Europe sent Columbus out with shaky maps and shaky faith, scared of falling off the edge. Africa had sailors who knew the winds by nickname, who could smell a coastline days before they saw it. They tell you Columbus found America. Found? Like the people already there were invisible, like civilizations were just props waiting for a white lead actor to enter the scene. Nah, America was already a full verse in Earth's poem before Columbus ever mispronounced its name. But here's the part they don't teach. While Europe was stumbling into continents, Africa was already in conversation with them, trading, teaching, leaving fingerprints in stone, in language, in bloodlines. They paint Europe as the explorer, Africa as the explored, Europe as the discoverer, Africa as the discovered. But let's flip that lens. Europe needed to escape its own darkness, plague, poverty, religious chokeholds, so it went searching for light in lands it didn't understand. Africa was the light. The original library, the first laboratory, the oldest university sitting on sun-soaked soil while Europe still thought the earth was flat, and God hated questions. Columbus was not a beginning. He was a continuation of a long European habit. Show up, rename, rewrite, then call yourself the author. But the truth is older than their textbooks, older than their flags, older than their fragile pride. Columbus didn't discover America, he just walked into a story already in motion. Then Europe grabbed the pen and tried to erase the opening to chapters. Africa kept the backup copy, in memory, in rhythm, in the quiet knowing of a people who've seen this movie before and are tired of the rerun. And now the credits are being corrected. The cast list is changing, the camera is panning wider, because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you're ready for the next question. If that was a lie they told with a straight face, what else have they been so confident and so wrong about? Stay seated. Africa's about to answer. They told you Columbus discovered America like nobody was here, like the land was empty, like the rivers were waiting for a European name to make them real. They said it with maps, with statues, with school books, with holidays. They said it so long you started to doubt your own eyes. But now you know, the lie is leaking. The costume is falling off. The stage lights are too bright for their little story to keep working. So let's walk it back. Let's strip it down. Before Columbus got lost chasing gold and spices, there were nations here, empires here, cities, trade routes, calendars, astronomers, farmers who could read the sky, engineers who could move stone like it weighed nothing. Before his ships scraped these shores, people were praying here, loving here, arguing politics over fire and food, telling stories to their children about where they came from and where they were going. He didn't discover anything, he just arrived uninvited and wrote his name over someone else's chapter. And that's the trick, right? Not just erasing people, but erasing the memory that they were ever there. They did the same thing to you, Africa. They talk like you were born in chains, like your story started in a ship's belly, stacked like cargo, like your first breath was salt water and grief. They skip over the 1,000 years where your cities were libraries, where your libraries were galaxies, where your gold lit up the desert sun, where your scholars were writing books Europe would later brag about discovering. They don't mention Mansa Musa walking across history, dripping wealth so heavy the price of gold bent around him. They don't mention Great Zimbabwe rising from stone, walls so precise they still stand there like a question mark over everything they taught you. They don't mention Nubia, Kush, Kemet, Axum, Benin, Oyo, Songhai, kingdoms with tax systems, diplomats, armies, philosophies, architects, astronomers charting the same stars they later said you couldn't even name. They don't mention the sailors from Mali who rowed the Atlantic's back before Columbus was even a rumor. Black hands on wooden oars, black eyes reading the waves, black minds doing the math to cross an ocean without a European map to bless the journey. Because if you knew that, if you really knew that, you'd stop asking for a seat at the table and start asking who built the house. See the pattern yet? Call it discovery when they show up. Call it civilizing when they invade. Call it trade when they loot. Call it progress when you disappear. They buried your story under theirs and then handed you a shovel and told you to dig your own doubt. But the ground is talking now. It's in the bones they unearthed that don't match the lies. It's in the manuscripts sleeping in desert libraries. It's in the bronze and gold they locked in European museums and labeled primitive while guarding it with lasers and alarms. It's in your grandmother's tongue when she slips back into a language older than every flag on this planet. The truth has been patient, but it's not shy. Columbus didn't discover America. They discovered a new way to sell you a story and erased the author. So here we are. You sitting with this discomfort. Me dragging the curtain back. History standing in the doorway like, you ready now? Because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you have to face it. You've been living in someone else's script. They wrote you in as background, as victim, as side character, as the one who needed saving, never the one who built, created, imagined, led. But look at you, still here, after ships, after whips, after borders carved with foreign hands, after schools that taught you to doubt your own reflection. Still here, your blood remembers what your textbooks forgot. You are not a footnote in European adventure tales. You are the plot. You are the land they kept discovering over and over because they couldn't stand that you existed without them. So now, What do you do with that? You stop begging to be included in their little myths. You start telling your own. You start teaching your children that Africa is not just where we were taken from, it's what we still are. You tell them about libraries in Timbuktu, where the dust smelled like knowledge and the books were stacked like prayers. You tell them about black astronomers who charted the sky so well they could plant by the stars and sail by the moon. You tell them about queens and kings who didn't need Europe's permission to be royal. You tell them about the architects who pulled cities out of earth and stone with no blueprints but the ones in their minds. You tell them, we are older than their lies. We are deeper than their maps. We are wider than their borders. And then you ask the real question. If they lied about Columbus, what else did they lie about? Who else did they shrink to make themselves look tall? What other names did they bury? What other miracles did they rename primitive? Because they didn't understand them. How many times have you looked in the mirror through their eyes and called yourself less when you were always more? This is not about hating them. This is about finding you. Because the day you stop swallowing their stories whole is the day you start writing again. You pick up the pen with hands that carry generations. You write in your mother's accent, your father's scars, your people's laughter. You write in Wolof, in Amharic, in Zulu, in Twi, in Yoruba, in Swahili, in Arabic, in French, in English, whatever tongue you've got left, you twist it into truth. You stop waiting for permission to love where you come from. You stop apologizing for being the descendants of the first architects, first mathematicians, first healers, first storytellers, first dreamers, to look at the night sky and see a map instead of a ceiling. You understand this. They needed the lie. You don't. They needed Columbus to discover America so they could pretend history started when they walked in. You don't need that. You had history before their boats, before their flags, before their language pressed itself into your mouth. What you need now is memory. Sit with it. Let it sting. Let it burn away the shame they planted in your chest. Because that shame is not yours. Those chains are not yours. That smallness is not yours. Stand up inside yourself. Feel how big you are when you remember you come from people who mapped stars, moved rivers, built kingdoms, crossed oceans, raised cities, and still found time to sing. Columbus didn't discover America, but you are about to discover yourself. You are about to discover that Africa is not a wound. It's a well, not a grave, a galaxy. You are about to discover that every time they tried to bury you, they were just planting a seed. So when the world asks, confused and trembling, how did you grow back after everything we did? You look them in the eye and say, calm, steady, unshaken. Because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you stop letting liars tell you who you are. Because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you stop mistaking their spotlight for the sun. Because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you understand the greatest discovery waiting to happen was never a continent. It was you remembering yourself. And when that hits, when it lands in your chest and won't let go, you'll hear it echo over and over like a drum that refuses to die. Columbus didn't discover America. You did. When you opened your eyes, Columbus didn't discover America. You did. When you broke their story, Columbus didn't discover America. You did. When you finally saw that every lie they told about this land was practice for the lies they told about yours, stay seated. Feel that truth in your bones, because once you realize Columbus didn't discover America, you're ready for the next question. And Africa, patient, ancient, unbothered, has been waiting to answer.